Hey everybody, I just wanted to jump in real quick and dive in a little bit on this whole mixtape controversy that's going on. So, Mixtape is this game, this coming of age story, really centered more around the licensed soundtrack. And, I've been seeing all the hubbub, about all the perfect scores, 10 out of 10s that it's been racking up, game of the year talk, all that. And so I decided to go ahead and pull it up on Game Pass and just kind of get a taste of it, see if it is as bad as people make it out to be, or if it's as great as people make it out to be. And what I find is that a lot of the worst complaints about it are true. In the opening moments, I literally just sat my controller down and watched it guide itself down without a problem. Yeah, it moved slower that way, because you're bumping into the walls and it's correcting itself. And then once you get kind of through the opening credits, it then gets you into another mode of skateboarding where, yeah, you do have to control it a little bit. But I mean, here's the thing. One of the first things it did where it indicated that, okay, I do have to control it a little bit was, my character ran right into a light post. But, it doesn't, send you flying or whatever and then start you back at the top of the hill. No, it does a little rewind thing and then puts you back on path. And that right there told me all I needed to know about this. It confirmed a lot of the footage I was seeing where people were doing basically through varying parts of the game the same thing. They were just setting their controller down, and no matter what happened, you still ended up at the end result. There was no real chance for failure. And so this isn't really a game. This is an interactive movie more than anything else. To it I say, make a movie. But I know the distribution and making the money back on a movie is a little different when you already have kind of the distribution and the automatic, deals and back end on the video game side of things. But, I mean, just make a movie. And I think this is where these 10 out of 10 scores are really rankling people. If the story hits for you, that's great, wonderful. But as I've said many, many times over, I don't play a game for the story. I play a game because the game is fun. The gameplay is fun. That's why I play video games, to play a game, to have fun. If it happens to have a 10 out of 10 story that goes along with that game, super fun gameplay, great, fantastic. That is a bonus. Because here's the thing I've noticed about gaming, and I've been gaming, for over 40 years, is that a stellar story cannot make up for shitty gameplay. However, amazing, tight, fantastic gameplay can make up for a shitty story. It can't go the other way around. If the gameplay is non-existent and broken and it's boring, it doesn't matter how great the storyline is, I'm not going to suffer through it. Prime example of this is Jedi Survivor, where the parkour elements in that are so game-breaking for me. It doesn't matter how good of a Star Wars story that is, I can't progress further in the game because it's just the parkour elements are too damn frustrating. I can't go forward. And I want to play through the story. I want to get through the story. But just the gameplay mechanics are so fucking awful and frustrating. I can't go forward. And some people, they're able to do it and they're willing to go through the Force tiers, level and stuff like that. I haven't even gotten there yet. Like, I'm stuck on one where you got to go up an elevator shaft where you have to, like, jump and then push and then lift and then jump and then push and then lift and run and wall run and jump and pull and jump and pull and bounce and roll, like, and it's just, like, After a good 20, 30 minutes of trying to get through that with no other way around the level, I dipped out. And I haven't reinstalled it since to even try to play through it. You know, so I mean, that's a prime example for me that good story will not make up for terrible gameplay. And so, when you're reviewing games, one of the things that you're primarily reviewing is how is this as a game? How does it function as a game? And it doesn't matter whether the story hits you in the feels or not. A game with terrible, boring gameplay does not deserve a 10 out of 10. Period. Full stop. It doesn't matter how much this storyline hits you in your heart and in your feels and everything else. That's great. It's got a 10 out of 10 story. But it's got a 2 gameplay. You got to average those things together if you're being an honest game reviewer. There is no gameplay here. What is the gameplay? If I can set my controller down and the game basically plays itself, you've given me a barely interactive movie. And it's so sad because, all these game companies that do reviews, these used to be great, places to go, great resources. Because people understood what they were reviewing. They were reviewing games. And, we've seen this thing fall because, one, it becomes corporate. So everything gets a mushed, mediocre, everyone jokes, the IGN, 7 out of 10. For reviews, it's basically pointless because you don't know. Is that 7 out of 10 like an amazing game? But because you guys are so corporatized, you're only giving it a 7 out of 10? Or is this a 7 out of 10, a mediocre slop fest full of microtransactions and the worst of corporate America? Like, which is it? You don't know because you can't trust these reviews. And, like I said, I don't care if it's got a 10 out of 10 story that makes you cry at the end. It's not a good game. It's not as a game. As an interactive movie, it's barely an interactive movie, like I said. During those first moments, I just set my controller down and let it rip to verify whether or not what I was seeing online was true about the game. And I confirmed it within the first 5 minutes. There was nothing. There was no gameplay there. And when I did get to a point where I did have to move my character even just a little bit, there was no challenge. There was nothing there. I mean, and like I said, I let it rip and the character ran into a pole and then it just immediately rewound and put them back on track. So your choices have no consequences. Like I said, that's like a 1 or a 2 on gameplay. I'm reminded of the old GamePro rating scale where it rated everything separately. Graphics were rated here, story here, gameplay here, fun factor here, replayability. You had a scale and each thing got its own thing and then they averaged the review. So yeah, this has a 10 out of 10 story, but it's barely a game. In the loosest sense of the word, in that there are moments where you do have to control your person, but it ultimately is going to autopilot you to where it needs to go to tell the story. And that gets into, this is a frustration I've had for a while with some of these games where the gameplay is an afterthought to the story they want to tell. And in that instance where I say, just make an animated movie. I think the reception for the, mixtape is wildly different if you take it out of the context of being a video game. I think if you take Mixtape and you take all the gameplay elements out of it and recut all the stuff so that the story is a linear movie, and you release that as an animated movie, you become the critical darling. You're probably getting nominated for an Oscar. Because you're telling this kind of John Hughes 80s, 90s, story in animated form, which is not common. And by all accounts, like I said, I didn't play deep into it because I was mainly just checking to see, like, okay, is the gameplay really as autopilot as they're making it out to be? And once I confirmed that for myself, I was done because I really don't have that much interest in it as a story. I grew up watching John Hughes movies. I don't need to watch a rehash of John Hughes in video game form just because the story might be great. That's a waste of my time. I'll just watch a movie. Especially when there's barely any need for me to play it anyway. But like I said, if you take Mixtape and you take that story and you take all the animation and you just recut this as an animated film and add in, the, bits of animation where it needs to fill in the gaps where, these kind of gameplay moments are, and release that into theaters, you're probably going to get nominated for a Best Animation Oscar. Absolutely. I can tell you that right now. Because, that Oscars animated field is widening greatly from the days of Illumination, DreamWorks, and Disney. It's branching out wildly. This year it was K-pop Demon Hunters, which kind of came out of nowhere. Now that, movie still does fit the mold of the kind of kids movie dynamic, but it's a lot different. And, we've seen Studio Ghibli knock some out of the park in the Oscar field lately. So, I think that if you were to release that movie as an Oscar eligible feature film, I guarantee you it's getting an Oscar nomination, if not the win. Just going off of critical reception to the story alone. And looking at the look of it in, how it kind of fits this current, kind of non-Disney aesthetic of animation. I think you release it as a movie, probably an Oscar nom at minimum, if not the win. Golden Globe nomination, if not the win. The problem is that, they're so tied into the gaming ecosystem. The idea of making a movie probably doesn't even enter into it because they've got all this kind of automatic money. They know, okay, well, we know if we release this as a game, it's going to go here, it's going to go here. We got to deal with Game Pass. It's going to bring in this much money. And so it's an automatic, they have the calculation in there. What they should have done is take the risk and make the movie. Just make the movie. Odds are it probably would have even cost less to do as a movie than what it cost them to make it as a game. So you could really look at it as a negligible. And plus, once word of mouth started getting around, more and more people would be going and seeing it in the theaters. If they did do an independent release on their own, odds are they would have dropped it at Sundance. And there probably would have been a freaking bidding war over it. So at a minimum, they would have gotten probably Netflix money or Apple TV money. Easy. They would have gotten that would have gotten bought as a movie by one of the majors. Easy. And like I said, this has been one of my biggest frustrations in years with gaming, has been the idea of these games that are story first, gameplay last. At that point, just make an animated movie. Just make an animated movie. There is a hunger for more adult, more mature, animated storytelling in this country. And some of these video game companies that are making these video games that are super niche, that aren't making a shit ton of money, could easily put out as an animated movie and do what really well, because they're going to be filling a need within the audience base of animation that would eat that stuff up. I can tell you right now, given the status of animation fans in the US, they dropped this as an animated movie. There's a whole fan base of animation, fans that would just eat it up. They would just eat that up. They would buy that 4K. They would go probably see it 2 or 3 times. So, and that's just kind of my little rant about this, because like I said, it hits a certain couple of points for me that drive me nuts. Like I said, one, video game companies that do this story first, gameplay last, should have just been a movie kind of mentality, kind of games, just make the movie. Just make the movie. Anyway, let me know what you think. Do you think that, this should have just been a movie like I do? Or, is there something I'm missing? Is there some great gameplay, challenge that's lost in translation here that maybe I'm missing the point on? Let me know in the comments. And I'll see you in the next video.